Thank you. So I think if there are no pressing questions, we just continue with Giulia. Giulia Lamoni is a FCT researcher at the Art History Institute at the Nova University in Lisbon, and she's interested in her research in the articulations of contemporary art and feminism in between Portugal and Latin America in the 60s and 70s. And she will speak, or rather ask, how do we work together?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you all and to thank the organizers, especially Jenny, for bringing me here. It's an honor, and I'm very happy to talk to you today about this question that I would like to ask: how do we work together? I propose you to follow me to Buenos Aires. Even if you have never traveled to the Argentinian capital, you may know the place where we are going. The house on the Calle Garay in the neighborhood of Constitución was destroyed. Nevertheless, you may remember it from Jorge Luis Borges' famous story, El Aleph, first published in 1945. As the owners of the house manifest their project to tear it down, its last residents, the aspiring poet Carlos Argentino Daneri, reveals to the narrator the presence of an Aleph in the basement. The Aleph is, in Daneri's words, I quote, "the place where all places on earth are, seen from every angle without confusion," end quote. Although the narrator, a writer himself, called Borges, first considers Daneri as a madman, the experience of the Aleph unsettles him and leads him to a reflection on the very nature of human memory and its boundaries. The dream of totality, or I would use also the term globality, that the Aleph encapsulates stands in direct opposition to what Donna Haraway famously called in a 1988 text, situated knowledges. If the fictional Aleph represents a dangerous illusion of total mastery over space and knowledge, seeing everything from every possible angle, while ironically being situated in a very anecdotic place, a basement in the city of Buenos Aires, Donna Haraway proposes, on the other hand, I quote, "the privilege of a partial perspective." Dealing with the question of objectivity from a feminist perspective, Haraway uses, like Borges, vision as a metaphor. But if the Aleph embraces the godlike possibilities of vision as distance and mastery, Haraway proposes to reclaim vision as profoundly embodied. I quote, "I would like to suggest how our insisting metaphorically on the particularity and embodiment of all vision, although not necessarily organic embodiment and including technological mediation, and not giving in to the tempting myths of vision as a route to disembodiment, allows us a usable but not innocent doctrine of objectivity. In this sense, I quote, feminist objectivity is about limited location and situated knowledge, not about transcendence and splitting of subject and object. It allows to become answerable for what we learn how to see," end quote. Now consider the video piece Aleph by Brazilian artist Lia Shaya, created in 2013. We exhibited this video in Lisbon in an exhibition that I co-curated with Margarido Brito Alves and Filomena Serra at Casa de América Latina in 2017, titled Cohabiting. The video was shot on the top of a high building in São Paulo, in Brazil, thus offering an overlying view of the city. A dancer, we only see his or her arm, manipulates a glass sphere, filtering and distorting the image of the city with its skyscrapers. Besides its striking juxtaposition of the organic and the artificial, as it is often the case in the work of Lia Shaya, the video seems to explore the spectator's desire to dominate her or his surroundings through vision from above, hence the skyscrapers, and its irreparable failure. Even when an optic device is used to reduce and concentrate wider space, the result is inversion, distortion, and transformation. The title of the work, Aleph, could be read as ironic. How can we imagine seeing everything from every possible angle when even the city where we live can only be apprehended fragment by fragment? I think we can show a little bit of the video just for you to have an idea. On Sunday, last Sunday, on a Ryanair flight from Lisbon to Berlin, while trying to calm down my anxiety of flying, especially with Ryanair, and to put ideas in order for this talk, a minor source of anxiety compared to the flight, I spent my time reading the Portuguese translation of Grada Quilomba's Plantation Memories, Episodes of Everyday Racism, this book, that was published in Germany in 2008, and it came out in Portugal only in 2019. While deconstructing the supposed neutrality of knowledge produced in academia, Western European academia, and its marginalization of black students and academics, Grada Quilomba writes, I quote, "I therefore call for an epistemology that includes the personal and the subjective as part of academic discourse. For we all speak from a specific time and place, from a specific history and reality. There are no neutral discourses. When white scholars claim to have a neutral and objective discourse, they are not acknowledging the fact that they too come from a specific place, which of course is neither neutral nor objective or universal. It is a place of power," end quote. While I read the Portuguese translation, Portuguese is not my mother tongue as I am Italian, but I live in Portugal. The silver cover of Quilomba's translated book works as an almost mirror, reflecting my face at multiple times and projecting light all over the Ryanair aircraft cabin. It reminds me the partiality and situatedness of my own positioning and the need to clarify from where I speak, especially at a conference on museum when I do not work in one. I am a researcher in art history in a public university in Portugal, who sometimes curate exhibitions, most often collaboratively. It also reminds me of the key role that a partial perspective and situated knowledges, as articulated by Donna Haraway and subsequently by other authors, among them Grada Quilomba, played in my own education and in what I try to convey to my students as a teacher. What I propose to briefly explore in this intervention is if and how situated knowledges and a partial perspective can be useful tools to keep in mind when we think about the possible relation between museums and the idea of the global. After all, we can all agree, I think, that we do not want the global, as in global museum, to run the risk of becoming the disembodied space of the Aleph. In this context, I am particularly interested in the relation between curating and art historical research, between the museum and the research center. Of course, many texts have been written on museum global aspiration, and among them, just to cite two, Soloni Matur's Museums and Globalization in 2005, and more recently, the Globalized Museum, Decanonization as Method, a Reflection in 3 Acts by Bonaventure So Begen Dikun, published in Mus Magazine in 2017. In the Portuguese context, in the same year, I wrote a text titled Beyond the Global Dream, Transnational Challenges in the Modern and Contemporary Art Museum, that was published in a small magazine online in Portugal, Wrong Wrong. It is in fact thanks to this text that Jenny got in touch with me for this conference. The text was written at a time in which I was a Brooks Fellow at Tate Modern Curatorial in London and a resident at Delfina Foundation, also in London. And the text was written for a conference in Lisbon, a very, very local meeting. I decided to write that text that was completely out of my comfort zone because my research is basically on feminism and art production in Portugal and Brazil, and on question of art and migration, especially between Latin America and Southern Europe, with a specific focus between always Portugal and Brazil. So I decided to write that text because on one hand, I was extremely curious and positively impressed by Tate's effort to create a more diverse transnational narrative of the developments of modern and contemporary art. In the words of Francis Morris, the director of the institution, this is from a 2016 interview, I quote, "The collection was originally built according to a dominant art history which we are all very familiar with, but the real story is a much bigger one because that dominant story left out a lot of places and a lot of practices and a lot of women artists. We haven't rewritten the history, but we are asking questions about the history and plotting coordinates." It seemed great to me that an institution like Tate was finally buying and displaying artworks by artists like Argentinian Mirta de Ermisace. I'm just quoting one because I'm familiar with the story of her work, which was some works were bought in 2017. Mirta de Ermisace, whose work was championed during many years in Europe by less visible but very engaged agents like assistant curator Annalisa Rimaudo at Centre Pompidou and the publisher of artist book Florent Fajol in Paris. I should also mention that the archives of Mirta de Ermisace are in Buenos Aires, kept by a wonderful team at a foundation that is called Espigas, that you may know, that collects archives by artists and keeps them there and makes them available for researchers. On the other hand, and underline an immediate enthusiasm, I had many questions regarding, for instance, the risk of a practice of inclusion as a form of branding the museum without any systemic transformation. Also, if a transnational narrative of modern art becomes the new canon, which institution will have the economic, scientific, and symbolic means to articulate such a narrative? That is, if they want to. What are the consequences of global policies of acquisition by Western museums on local institutions and their possibilities to acquire works by local artists? Finally, and perhaps most importantly for me, I was convinced that if the transnational was so meaningful in a complex and multifaceted institution like Tate, it should not only be meaningful as a theme around which artworks were assembled and displayed together. The emphasis on the transnational constituted, in my opinion, an invaluable challenge to think about the practice and the politics of how we work together transnationally, institutions like museums, research centers, university archives, etc. How do we work together when our symbolic as well as economic capital in the globalized cultural field, to put it like Bourdieu, is clearly different, when our knowledges are shaped by different perspectives and positionings, when our history are so different and often include shared histories of colonization, as between Portugal and Brazil, for instance. And for this reason, I organized a very small symposium at Delfina Foundation at that time that was called Beyond the Global Dream, Exploring Transnational Ways of Working Together, which was a closed meeting that we hope to continue in the future. In 2017, when I was a Brooks Fellow at Tate, I had the impression that the interest in representing transnational moments of connection traversing works in the collection at Tate Modern possibly meant a renewed alliance with art historical narratives and academic research, as opposed to a dominantly thematic presentation. In particular, the curatorial form, a view from Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, from Tokyo, and from Zagreb, which is still there in the display of the collection, propose a display mode focusing on a number of moments of encounter and co-participation involving artists of different nationality, thus bridging over the regional division within the collection. These moments are constituted by exhibitions considered particularly significant as transnational and transformative nodes in the history of modern and contemporary art, as for example the São Paulo Biennial in Brazil in the beginning of the 1950s. In this sense, they temporarily suspend the thematic breadth of the display and reintroduce art history, and more specifically the history of exhibitions, as an important tool to shape a more transnational approach to artistic practice. In that article in 2017, I concluded that perhaps in an exploded field of transnational museum practice, curating and art history, and I'm borrowing Aruna de Souza and Jill Cassidy's proposal in Art History in the Wake of the Global Turn, transdisciplinary discussions, contamination and conflicts are meant to gain a renewed importance. In 2017, besides doing research in the field of conservation and learning activities, Tate also had a research center for Asian art that was financed between 2012 and 2019 by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. In 2009, the institution announced the creation of the Hyundai Tate Research Center Transnational, financed by Hyundai Motor for a period of 5 years. As the online video introducing the question, what is transnational art, makes clear, by proposing the answer of a range of academics, including art historian Iftikhar Dadi, Lydia Liu, Salah Hassan, etc., and the museum director and the director of exhibition, the center, it seems to me, at least from this documentation, that it was conceived as a space of encounter between museum professionals, academics and artists around the idea of art histories as interconnected and transnational, with a strong focus of decolonization. And I think that here the use of the term transnational and not global is particularly significant, important, I think. The center is set to produce research, organize symposia, host visiting fellows, and establish in partnership with other institutions. Its role seems to be very significant, as it will, I quote, help to determine the strategic direction for future acquisition, collection displays, and exhibition programs, end quote. It is certainly a challenging starting point, and it will certainly be interesting to follow its development. What kind of collaboration will this Museum Research Center establish with other research centers in public university, for example? How will the symbolic and economic and eventually political differences be negotiated? How do we work together? How do we work together when our voices do not have the same strength and the same reach? When one of us speaks and writes perfect English and the other does not? When one has access to the international press and a huge amount of visitors per year and the other can only count on local publishers? When one is financed to travel by her or his institution and the other has to be invited in order to attend? Let me draw a little bit from my experiences and those of my research group in Lisbon that is called Artists and Radical Education in Latin America. The group is composed by myself. I am Italian, living in Lisbon, Cristiana Tejo, who is a curator from Brazil, and Margarida Brito Alves, who is an art historian from Portugal. We are very much friends, which is very good, but sometimes complicates our work together. And in this group, we discuss a lot about these questions, and I think that I would like to express a few observations that emerge from our shared experience. This observation, it is useless to say, they are all corollaries. I'm not sure this name is pronounced like that in English, corollarios, of the idea of the importance of a partial perspective and situated knowledges. First, the rhetoric of rediscovery. Rediscovering an artist whose work was forgotten and understudied is often used in the press and to market museum exhibition. It has the effect, especially if it emanates from symbolically powerful institution, to obliterate the often strenuous work of those researchers and curators in small institutions, local as well as not local, who have accompanied, studied, written on, and exhibited the artist's work a long time on a lesser scale. A recent accident occurred with an article in The Guardian concerning artist Farlenisa Zaid's exhibition at Tate in 2017. I'm sorry, I'm insisting on Tate, but it could be any other example. So the title of the article in The Guardian was Farlenisa Zaid, Tate Modern Resurrects Artists Forgotten by History. The journalist Anna Ellis Petersen wrote, I quote, "She was an artist of such force and originality, says Tate Modern, that it is astonishing that Farlenisa Zaid should have been practically forgotten. Now, in the first retrospective of its kind in the UK, Tate Modern hopes to lift the pioneering Turkish artist out of obscurity to ensure that she does not become yet another female artist forgotten by history," end quote. We cannot know for sure if those were the exact words of the curator of an interpretation by the journalist. It is very difficult to say, but this rhetoric, even in the press of the rediscovery, I think that we can do without it. Not long after this article, a post in a blog was published by a writer named Yamal Kayabali from Turkey that was called A Response to The Guardian and the Tate, Eurocentrism at its best. So what Kayabali asked was, by whose art history was the artist forgotten? Certainly not by Turkish art history, and he proposes a series of examples of how actually Zaid is a quite central figure for Turkish scholars about Turkish art of the 20th century. Secondly, imagine that you are a researcher in a Southern European country. You participate in a conference like this one, that one museum curator from a well-known Northern European institution is also attending. You spend months, if not years, studying the works of a Portuguese artist, a woman well-known in Portugal but almost never exhibited outside the country. You present your reading of her work and are very happy because it is well received. A few months after the conference, you receive an email of a young curator from London who was at the conference. She saw your presentation and liked the artist's work so much that she is now presenting it in a small gallery there. This is great. She wants to acknowledge the fact that it is through your work that she first got to know the artist's pieces. A few months pass by, and in the local press, you read that the artist's work is now being presented in an institution in a European capital by the museum curator who also attended the conference. You are sure that before the conference, the curator did not know the artist's work. And of course, you are very happy because this artist, this woman, has struggled all her life to exhibit her work outside Portugal, and now she's very old. But you have not been contacted. Your name is nowhere. You have not been invited to write in the catalog, not even a note, a small message, not even an email to acknowledge the fact, thank you for your work. You feel like you have been the object of an extractivist attitude, the weak link in a chain. And before, when Christian was talking about this question of credit, I think that, I'm sorry, but it's very, very important in the relation between museum professionals and researchers. I'm not emotional, it's just I have pain in my throat. This is one of several stories I know. So before this intervention, I actually messaged via WhatsApp my research group. And so what can we tell, what can we not tell? This is not accusation at all. I mean, these are practices, and sometimes we do that too, and we are not aware of that. I'm just calling attention to the fact that we have to be attentive and sensitive. This is one of several stories that I know, and it is for this reason that I defend that footnotes, references, quotations are instruments that should be strategically and politically used to acknowledge the contribution of others to the shaping of one's narratives. After all, we are completely interdependent when it comes to knowledge production. Referencing is always important, but it comes particularly so when we work together in the context of asymmetrical power relations. For instance, when I write on Brazilian art in English, which I do many times, for a book published in the United Kingdom. The academic system in Portugal, but I suppose also in other countries, because it is marked by the precariousness of labor, stimulates great competition, and we were talking before about the question of competition. I do not know if it is the same for museum professionals in Germany and elsewhere, but I suppose that probably it is. Maybe we can discuss this later. Asserting that our perspective is partial and builds on the knowledge produced by other researchers, curators, artists, is also a way to resist the logic of precariousness and endless competition, in and out of the academy or in and out of the museum.